Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches, where today I will be talking about the clockpunk reimagining of The Three Musketeers, directed by Paul W.S. Anderson in 2011. And the film begins with the Musketeers Athos, Porthos and Aramis stealing airship schematics made by Leonardo da Vinci. They manage to retrieve the blueprints, but they are then betrayed by their contact and Athos's lover, Milady de Winter. She incapacitates the trio and sells the schematics to the Duke of Buckingham, the English ambassador to France. The mission's failure leaves the Musketeers in disgrace. A year later, a young man named D'Artagnan leaves his village in Gascony for Paris in hopes of becoming a musketeer, but en route he suffers embarrassment at the hands of the malevolent Captain Rochefort, a key employee of Cardinal Richelieu, who is the second most powerful man in France after the king. With his prickly pride bruised by this encounter, D'Artagnan manages to separately encounter and offend all three of Athos, Porthos and Aramis, and schedules duels of honour with each. When Cardinal Richelieu's guards turn up to arrest all four men, because duelling is illegal, the would-be adversaries band together and fight them off. Their defiance earns Cardinal Richelieu's enmity, but the Queen finds their behaviour to be gallant and brave. She persuades the king to reinstate them into his favour instead. Now, all of this is essentially just a preface to establish all of the main characters and initiate the film's actual plot. You see, Cardinal Richelieu has a secret plan to take over France and depose the king. He plans to frame the Queen as having an affair with the Duke of Buckingham. When news of this treachery comes out, King Louis would have no choice but to execute the Queen and declare war on England. Richelieu believes that in such a situation, the people would want a more experienced leader than the callow young monarch, and the only possible candidate, of course, would be the Cardinal himself. Richelieu's chief agent in this skullduggery? Why, none other than Milady de Winter, of course, which means that the Musketeers don't just have professional reasons to try and thwart his machinations, they have the added personal motivation of revenge on the woman who betrayed them. And so they and their new friend D'Artagnan, who has plenty of reason to dislike the Cardinal by now, set out to thwart the scheme and save the King and Queen. So this film is, of course, loosely based on the Alexandre Dumas novel of the same name. The book was immediately successful upon its release back in 1844, and it's been a favourite subject for screen adaptation ever since motion pictures became possible. The first production dates back to 1903, and this film was roughly the 30th cinematic adaptation of the story, and also has the dubious distinction of being the first and today only Musketeers film to be shot in 3D. Not that I watched it that way, I like my movies to stay in just two dimensions, thanks. Now, Paul W.S. Anderson assembled a pretty strong cast for the film, which was shot primarily in Germany. It also had its debut in that country, not appearing in US theatres until more than a month later. Now, financially, it proved a disappointment. It did quite well internationally, topping the box office on its opening weekend in Germany, Austria, Italy, Turkey and Brazil, and also performing well in Japan and the UK, but it did very poorly in the United States. Poor critical response probably didn't help its case, particularly as there was plenty of time for the European reviews to reach American audiences before they could see the movie, but at least one of the stars placed the blame firmly on the studio's marketing approach. Milla Jovovich, who plays Milady de Winter and is also married to the film's director, publicly took to Twitter to call out Summit Entertainment for failing to properly market the film as a fun family adventure. Summit, needless to say, were not particularly pleased by this. I don't know how valid Jovovich's complaints were. I never saw the US marketing, but I do think that the film is flawed. But it's still a more entertaining romp than its critical response suggests. So let's dig into the good and the bad in a little bit more detail. Now, depending on your perspective, the film's main pitch may be either a pro or a con for you. You see, other than 3D gimmickry, the central thing that distinguishes this version of the Musketeers is it's essentially working from the premise of what if, instead of being a straight-up work of historical fiction by Alexandre Dumas, the Three Musketeers was a Jules Verne-style scientific romance. This film is set in a world with literal airships, age of sail men of war, lifted into the skies by giant bags of helium. It's a world with 17th century scuba gear. It's a world full of clockwork death traps and other mechanical marvels. It is also a world that is frankly pretty silly and shallow because little effort is made to consider how these advanced technological elements would fit into the broader setting. I suspect Monsieur Verne would have done a better job of integrating the elements if he had actually written the book. But of course, the world isn't much changed by this world-changing thing. It is a conceit of many forms of fiction. Most comic books and comic book movies take place in a world that's recognisably our own, despite aliens verifiably existing and people inventing physics-defying technologies on a regular basis. An urban fantasy similarly tends to have a world that looks a lot like the one as we know it, except for all the werewolves and zombies and vampires running around. Now, I'm personally not too worried about the lack of follow-through on the clockpunk elements of the setting. It seems to me that they've been included mainly to serve the film's need for exciting action scenes and cool visuals, and on that basis I think they're a success. I certainly wasn't, while watching it, stopping to ask myself questions such as, wait, wouldn't this technology have profoundly changed international trade and relations? I was too busy watching the ships of the line engage each other in airborne broadsides and other such spectacles. Now, I think that I do think is demonstrably a problem of the film is the villains. The original Three Musketeers novel is comparatively sophisticated in its moral outlook. It certainly centres D'Artagnan, Athos, Porthos and Aramis as the protagonists and set others, such as Cardinal Richelieu, as antagonists, but it is not so simple as to make those antagonists unequivocally the villains and the protagonists unequivocally the heroes. D'Artagnan and his friends do morally dubious things at times, and although their goals often conflict with those of the Cardinal and his agents, the latter do not have uniformly nefarious motivations. In fact, in the novel and in real life, Richelieu is a great patriot of France the nation who works tirelessly to solidify the power of the king over the nobility. Screen adaptations have generally simplified the moral elements. Richelieu is often depicted as making an illicit grab for power, as he does in this one, and his agents are all similarly wicked. This movie goes a step further yet, making the Duke of Buckingham into yet another adversary for the Musketeers, rather than his usual role as a reluctant collaborator of theirs. While making him a foppish foe is not without its upsides, Orlando Bloom is great fun as the preening Duke. I think overall this muddies the film by turning him into yet another enemy. Having three factions, with prototypical femme fatale Milady de Winter actively trying to play off all three for her own ends, slows down the film's otherwise galloping pace and throws it off its stride a little bit, at least in my opinion. Which is a shame, because for most of this movie's relatively brisk runtime, it's an enjoyable romp filled with over-the-top action, cool visuals, and impressive stunts. It's obviously at least partly inspired by the structural style of the Marvel movies that had already come out by then, and it's certainly leaning heavily into the comic book action. Heck, in the opening sequence, each of the Three Musketeers even gets their own little splash page introduction. It's all very bombastic and silly, and, as Milla Jovovich said, clearly intended to be experienced like a theme park thrill ride, and not as anything more complex or nuanced than that. The over-top nature of the action sequences and the film's broad humour probably won't appeal to all audiences, and I do think the film misfires from time to time, particularly with the jokes. But if you're looking for a fast-paced, visually opulent action piece full of wisecracking heroes where you can just turn your brain off and enjoy the ride, then you might find this movie is a fun way to spend 100 minutes or so. Next time, I mentioned it last week, and I was foolish enough to actually watch it, the Asylum's 2024 film Snow White and the Seven Samurai. But that is next time. Until then, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you've seen this version of the Three Musketeers, let me know what you thought of it.